All right, everybody. This is a newer recorded one, hence the different appearance. Why my hair is longer and wearing the t-shirt. So this will be coming close to finishing up the entire third section. May stop at some point in time and make a couple different movies out of it. Don't know, just kind of how we get rolling. All right, so with this, we kind of got to think of a little bit of backtracking where we are up to this point in time, just so we know where we're moving forward. With formants, that's what we've been talking about an awful lot up to this point in time. That's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the class to a degree. But just remember, those are those resonant frequencies of the vocal tract. Those are those odd number multiples of the fundamental frequency. The vocal tract's got a lot of different resonant frequencies. Only the first three are going to be important for our purposes. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is because once you get up higher than that, like the frequency range is so high that we don't really have a lot of acoustic energy being transmitted at that point in time. We talked about that, like with the amplitudes and that 12 dB drop per octave. When we were thinking about that, when the amplitude of the harmonics are going to drastically decrease once you get up there really, really high. All right, but remember that key thing we're keeping in mind, like between source and filter, right? Harmonics, fundamental frequency, and harmonics, source, formants, filter. Okay, or just really, really keep those two separate as you're working your way through it. Okay. All right, so this is still kind of like a review, also kind of just putting it into different words. So as a complex periodic sound travels through a vocal tract, the fundamental and the harmonic frequencies are going to be amplified or dampened depending on the formant frequencies. Okay, so those that within that area are going to get resonated, and those that are further away from those formants are going to get dampened to a degree. Okay, you do have to remember that the vocal tract is a broadly tuned resonator, so it's not going to have to be overly specific. Okay, it will respond to a broad range of frequencies. Okay, so when we're looking back on the source filter graph, when you see that, when you saw that it wasn't just like a straight peak and then flatline and peak and then flatline and peak. Okay, remember we had that sweeping little mountain valley kind of thing which we were looking at. That's because it was responding to a range of frequencies around that one. Okay, and remember when we're thinking about changing those formants, changing those different peaks, we're doing that one by the process of articulation. So we change the formants or the resonating frequency by changing our articulators. So we create relatively small or relatively large resonating chambers. That's essentially what we're doing. Okay, so the larger ones are going to vibrate at lower frequencies, and the smaller ones are going to vibrate at higher frequencies. So, all right, and as I slowly sleep away so you can see that one word. All right, remember that the sound is going to come out of the lips. All right, it's going to have the same fundamental frequency as the glottis. All right, but the amplitude of the harmonics are going to change. So we're going to hear that fundamental frequency. We're just going to hear it as a very, very rich fundamental frequency, and it's going to have other sounds kind of carrying on in the orchestra that is the person's voice. All right, so produce a vowel. Up to this point in time, we're talking about producing a schwa. We keep that neutral vocal tract, and that's the picture which we've seen is producing the schwa. When we are in that, batteries running dead on my clicker. Okay, so when we're in that articulatory configuration to produce the right, the neutral vowel, the length of the pharyngeal cavity is going to be approximately the length of the oral cavity, although the pharyngeal cavity will always be a little bit bigger. Okay. So in that situation, when we produce in the neutral, we're going to have that 500, 1500, 2500, 3500 when we're producing that neutral vowel. That's the resonance response of a tube that is 17 inches, all right, the average male vocal tract. These numbers are not going to be appropriate or not going to be applicable when we start thinking about non-neutral vowels, okay, which are all of them except the schwa. Okay, to make it non-neutral, we change the size and length of our cavities using our articulators. Okay, and the main way in which we're going to do that one is by changing tongue constriction. Okay, so when I think about producing the neutral vowel, my tongue bunches up, and I have a pretty big pharyngeal cavity down low, and then a pretty big oral cavity in the front. Right, they're almost the same in size. That's why they're going to have pretty similar frequency characteristics, okay? But what happens when I move that tongue is I change the shape. I either make the oral cavity bigger or I make the pharyngeal cavity bigger a lot of times. There's other ways in which we can alter it, but that's going to be the primary means by which we're doing it. Okay? So when the vocal tract becomes no longer neutral, that's when we're going to actually not follow that 1:3:5 ratio, that odd number multiple thing. So that means we're not going to be resonating 500, 1500, 2500 for the male vocal tract, okay? We're still going to have frequencies which we are doing it, all right? 500, 1500, 2500 is F1, F2, F3. I'm not saying we're going to lose F1, F2, F3. We're going to maintain F1, F2, F3, but we're not going to have it be 500, 1500, 2500. Those will take on new values, okay? This is part of what makes the vocal tract a variable resistor. We change it. Okay, we change it and it's going to resonate different things. All right, it's kind of like what's this stupid thing? A trombone. Okay, like we're changing the length of it. That's going to mean if I have my slide out to a certain length, then it's going to resonate at one frequency. If I shorten that slide, it's going to resonate at a different frequency. If it's extended all the way out, it's going to be at a different frequency. All we're doing in that situation is changing the lengths of the tubes, which are going to be resonating, okay? All right, so how do I go about changing each of these? All right, with F1, the easiest way to change that a lot of times is going to be from the mouth opening, right? We open the mouth, we scoot the tongue forward, we've made a bigger pharyngeal cavity. All right, a lot of times we have a really, really big F1, we're going to have a tongue that's going to be very, very far into the oral cavity. If I have a really, really small F1, okay, in terms of size, we're going to have that thing way in the back. Okay, so when we move our tongue, a lot of times that's going to have a drastic effect on F1. Okay, F2 is going to be a lot of times associated with changes in oral cavity size. Right, so if I have my tongue out of my oral cavity toward my pharyngeal cavity more, that's going to make a bigger oral cavity than it would be when my tongue's at normal rest. Okay, so that's what F2 is going to be responsive to. F3 is a little bit more kind of nebulous. It does seem to be kind of related to the length between the teeth and the lips. Therefore, rounding is going to be kind of the most obvious way in which we kind of change that one. So I also want to remember that when we're working through this stuff, any constriction in the vocal tract can result in a lowering of F1. So if we constrict something, we make it kind of a little bit lower. But then if we're doing some back tongue constriction, that's going to affect F2. But the important part about this slide is that like all our formants can kind of be lowered if we're sticking our lips out, right, or if we're lowering our larynx. Okay, so the way the country singers kind of lower their larynx like that, it actually has a purpose besides, I would claim looking like an idiot, but I think they think it's trendy. So that is part of just making a longer vocal tract. That's similar to sliding out the trombone thing. Right? We've made a longer tube, it's going to be lower in frequency. I stick my lips out, my vocal tract used to end here, and now ends wherever I can stick my lips out, not that far. Okay, but that would be the new length of the vocal tract. All right, so we're not going to learn an awful lot of we're not going to learn like all the vowels and where everything are. We're going to learn some bookmarks, which are going to allow us to kind of adapt and understand all the other vowels kind of based on where they are. Okay, so E, A, and U, we're going to look at these vowels and because they kind of represent in terms of placement and rounding the extremes. Okay, so E is a high front versus A is a low back. All right, in that situation, if we have high front, what's the front referring to? It's where my tongue is, and the A is low back, is where my tongue is. Right, now the U is going to be a rounded vowel. So in that situation, like I said on the previous slide, we're lowering it by lip protrusion. So we're going to lower the frequency of all the formants in that situation. All right, so let's think about E. All right, E, first of all, high front. Tongue is in the front. Right? F1 is going to be relatively what? If our tongue's in the front and F1's associated with the pharyngeal cavity size. Okay? Let's produce that one. Let's start with E. Now think about what it is that your tongue is actually doing in order to produce that. E. It's moving forward. All right, in that situation, so if I take my tongue, which is normally resting here, and I move it forward, okay, what have I done to the pharyngeal cavity, which is going to be associated with F1? I've made it bigger, okay? So instead of playing my trumpet, I've now picked up a tuba. Is my tuba lower in frequency or higher in frequency? Okay, it's going to be lower in frequency. Big things, low frequencies. All right, so F1 is relatively large because I brought my tongue toward the front of my mouth. I've made room with my pharyngeal cavity. All right, F1 is relatively large and resonates at relatively low frequencies. Okay, once again, what type of vowel is this? It's a high front, meaning I'm bringing my tongue into the front, into the oral cavity, which is in the front, right? So my F2 is going to be relatively what? F2 is going to be relatively small. Okay, I have my oral cavity, I'm shoving the tongue into it. I'm putting the tongue into the oral cavity, eating up space. E. That's why I'm putting my tongue in. I'm eating up space within that oral cavity. Okay, so it's going to be relatively small. All right, so now I've dropped my tuba and picked up a trumpet. So I'm going to have higher frequencies. Okay, F2 is relatively small and resonates at higher frequencies. Right? F3, it's an unrounded vowel. Okay, if we have an unrounded vowel, for our purposes, F3 is going to be small. Okay, F3 is relatively small and it's going to resonate at relatively high frequencies. All right. So let's actually look at a picture of this. This is the configuration that we would see for E. So what we don't have here is a picture of where it is at rest, but you can kind of, I can't point on this one because my arm eats up by the top of the box. But you can see that it would be more toward the back, it would be more toward that crook that exists within that little schematic, which is designed to represent the vocal tract. Okay, so we see we have a great pharyngeal volume and a very, very small oral volume, which is going to be associated with a very, very low frequency F1 and a very, very high frequency F2. Okay, if you want to at home, you can draw some nice little set of lips on the end of it, and they won't be rounded. Okay, because we don't round our vowels for E. All right, so that's what we're going to kind of see here. All right, we're eventually going to be able to go to the source filter theory and be able to diagram these out, how they would look. Let's think about ah. Okay, ah was our low back vowel. Okay, back meaning putting our tongue in the back. Okay, so let's just start with ah. All right, that will sound great if you put it on repeat and just remix it a couple times. So if you're gliding from and you want to get to you're going to shove your tongue toward the back. All right. So in that situation, we'd have our tongue, which is at rest, so we're moving it toward the back. We're moving it into the pharyngeal cavity. What are we doing to the pharyngeal cavity? Okay, we're making it smaller. We're eating it up with tongue. All right, so if the pharyngeal cavity is relatively smaller, the F1 is going to resonate at relatively higher frequencies. Are they going to be higher than F2? Nope. All right, the pharyngeal cavity will always be bigger than will the oral cavity. Okay, so there's never a situation where F1 and F2 can reverse. All right, the pharyngeal cavity in this situation is going to vibrate at high frequencies, but it's not going to be as high as it would be with the oral cavity in F2. Okay, the oral cavity, we took our tongue and we moved it to the back, so we've now made it become a bigger cavity. All right, so oral cavity is relatively larger, so F2 will resonate at relatively low frequencies. Big things, low frequencies. We're still not rounding our lips, okay? So it's still going to be relatively small. It's still going to resonate at relatively high frequencies. Okay? All right, I don't have a picture for that one. All right, so we'll move on to the oo. I do have a picture for oo coming up in just a minute. But what are we doing with oo that we're not doing with the other two vowels which we presented? Okay, we are rounding our lips for the oo. Okay, we're doing lip protrusion, which elongates the entire vocal tract, which will have an effect on all of them, all right? It makes our pharyngeal cavity large. Okay, so the pharyngeal cavity is going to vibrate at low frequencies, okay, because it's going to be big. All right, F2 is also large, and F3 is going to be larger than usual, but still small, all right? So what's the frequency response of F2? F2, if it's large, is going to be low. Okay, F3 is going to be relatively low. Okay, so if we were trying to determine what oo is going to look like, we know we would have a low F1, a low F2, and a low F3. Okay, lower than we would for all the others. All right, here would be a picture for that one, okay? So if you want to skip back and forth between this one and the previous one, you can see that we have a much bigger oral volume in this situation than we did before. All right, we also have a big pharyngeal volume. All right, now I did say that there was other ways in which we can do it. It's not, I don't want you to think the tongue is just like some balance where we have to move it forward, move it back. In this situation, when we're producing the oo, we actually kind of bunch up our tongue. Okay, so it's resting and it's taking up a lot of space in both cavities, and then we bunch it up and it's not taking up as much space in either one of them. So it's laid out kind of like this, and then it gets flatter like that. Okay, so that means we're actually making both cavities big. We don't have to borrow from one to give to the other. Okay, we can actually have a win-win situation in terms of size for these. All right, so these pictures are all redundant. They're all showing us the exact same thing. Okay, they're all showing us size of the different cavities. And now how we go about doing this is we sit there and we see what the response is in the situation. Now, first thing I want to mention is that, like, if you're looking at these top to bottom, realize that the scale is a little bit different, right? They're zoomed in a little bit different. The one on the top, okay, has 300 all the way as its first thing, but if you look down below, 270 is actually to the right of this situation. So I don't want you to sit there and just do a visual comparison. We do have to look at the numbers that are going to be associated with each of these, all right? So I don't have the schwa on here, but how the schwa looked. Remember the numbers that were associated with the schwa? 500, 1500, 2500, okay? So if I have a number that is lower than 500 in this situation, if I have a number that's lower than 500, which 300 and 270 are, okay, what did I do to the pharyngeal cavity in order to make that number lower? Okay. I made the pharyngeal cavity bigger in that situation. Okay, so in both of these sounds, E and oo, we have a bigger F1, a bigger pharyngeal cavity, which is lower in frequency. Okay, we have a lower in frequency F1 for both of these sounds. Okay, so that doesn't tell us whether or not this is E or oo. If it's E, that's a back vowel. If it's oo, it's a back vowel and it's rounded. All right, so in both those situations, we can say, okay, it could be E or oo in both those situations. All right, so then we have to look at F2. F2, remember, was going to be associated with which of our cavities? F2 is going to be associated with our oral cavity. Okay? Remember, if we have a big oral cavity, it's going to have a low frequency. If we have a small oral cavity, it's going to have a high frequency. So what do we know about this peak right here? What do we see on that one? We see 850 versus 2,290. All right. Which one's going to have a bigger oral cavity? The top one. Okay, the top one has a bigger oral cavity. Right, how do I know that? Because 850 is a far lower number than is 2,290. All right, that's enough for us to answer this question right now, if this is E or oo. All right, we'll move on and we'll talk about the third format here in just a second, but that's enough information that we have right there, okay? So we know one thing about this top vowel up here, okay? One is that my arm will not point to it, all right? The other thing that we know is that we have a big pharyngeal cavity, and we also have a big oral cavity, all right? The top one has a big pharyngeal cavity and a big oral cavity. The bottom one has a big pharyngeal cavity and a small oral cavity, right? Because what was the schwa? 500, 1500. 270 is much lower than 500, right? Yep, so it has a bigger pharyngeal cavity. 2,290 is much bigger than is 1,500, right? Yep, that means we have a much smaller oral cavity, okay? Bottom, big oral, big pharyngeal, small oral. Top, big pharyngeal, big oral. Once again, that's enough to know whether or not which one's E or oo. But let's move on to the third format here. We have 2,240 or we have 3,010, okay? In that situation, we look at what the schwa is supposed to be. Schwa is 500, 1,500, 2,500. Okay, in order to lower that third one, I'm going to have to do some lip protrusion. Okay, which one of these is a lower frequency, 2,240 or 3,010? That would be 2,240. So which one of these are we likely rounding our lips in? The top one or the bottom? The top one, okay? That would give us the top one being oo. All right? So that's what we get here. The top one is U, the bottom one is E. Let's look at the picture of these. Once again, this is a redundant way of showing it, okay? This bottom one is that we were just looking at on the previous slide. That's showing us the amplitude of the harmonics, okay? The top section of this slide is actually showing us the output function, okay? So we're seeing the source plus the filter. That's the filter function on the top, right? The bottom one's going to be the output function. So we're seeing that these are the F1, F2, F3s that we would associate with the sound E, right? A peak at 270, a peak at 2290, and a peak at 3010, all right? Will be our F1, F2, F3. All right, then we have U. This is the response which we saw was on the top of when we had the E or U slide. So in this situation, we can see that we have a low F1, a low F2, and then a relatively low F3. Okay, so if you don't remember what they are, just remember 500, 1500, 2500. That number is pretty important to keep in your head, and you can kind of adjust from all those other ones. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to make us know what all the vowels in the diagram are in this situation, but I do want us to keep in mind that this is associated with the movement which is occurring, all right? This is where the speech science comes in. This is where we're saying, if I do this with my tongue, then I do this to the acoustics of the sound which is being produced, okay? So if I move my tongue forward, all right, I've ate up some of the oral cavity that's going to increase the frequency response of my F2. So if I say, how do I get from 500 to 700 hertz on F2, okay, there's only one way in which you can do it. Okay, if my F2 in this sound is 500 and my F2 in this sound is 700, I'm making that oral cavity smaller. Okay, so even regardless of which sounds we're talking about, that general principle holds true. So that's the kind of stuff which we need to kind of understand here. All right. Let's take a small moment here before I move on. Just one more thing I did want to bring up. Like, just be sure that we're associating the peaks with what the physiological thing is actually occurring. All right. So this peak right here, I can point to it because it's down low. All right. I have a green screen behind me, so I have to kind of not too confident with my weather girling at the moment. But in that situation, when we're pointing at that thing, we know that that's going to be related to what my lips are doing, okay? If my lips are protruding, that's going to be that number down there. It's going to be a relatively low one. All right, over here, if we're looking at this one, I can know that if I have a relatively low in frequency, that means I'm going to have a big oral cavity. And then when I look at this one way, well, let me point that far. When I look way over there, I know that's going to be associated with the pharyngeal cavity, okay? So, all right, the question might become, you're probably not thinking it's at home, but if you were, kudos. The question might become, well, what about a diphthong, which is going to have two different kind of sounds that are associated with it? Remember, these are basically the combination of two different vowels, many of which us Southerners don't bother using. We tend to be just fine with half of the equation. Simplicity is bliss. But what we have in this situation is we actually have movement which occurs. We don't combine the two and produce one weird vowel. We produce a vowel, then put the other vowel on it, and we move in between them. So it has a transition phase on that situation. So in that situation, all we do is we produce two different series. Now that's an interesting thing because what we're looking at now would disallow you from actually using one of these to show a diphthong. Okay? Because remember, what do I not have a measure of on this situation? I do not have a measure of time. This is a photograph, not a video. Okay, I need a video to show something that changes as a function of time, and diphthongs change as a function of time. All right, so we don't have that occurring in this situation. All right, I do recommend that you watch this. It's a pretty good little review on those. All right, now let's actually move into kind of what we're talking about with spectrography, which is the way in which we visualize these types of things. Right? Sound spectrography is a graphic representation of the frequency and intensity of the sound pressure wave as a function of time. In the 40s, there were some scientists working for Bell Labs, and there were some others kind of international of where they were trying to do this one, and it was born out of war. We were basically trying to determine whenever we got an enemy audio recording, whether or not it was who was speaking on it, right? So we're trying to find out if it was Hitler or whatever it may be, right? So the difference between what we've been seeing, all right? This is spectrum. We're going to be making spectrograms, okay? Now, what we gain in this situation is usually going to be, we're going to be able to gain a function of time at this point. And that becomes really, really important because we're talking about speech science. Speech by its definition changes, all right? Speech is not, okay? Speech is not like one steady state sound that's just going to just repeat. That's noise, okay? We're going to talk about speech, which is different phonemes, all right? So there's movement involved in all these, and we have to have that measure of time in order to kind of display it. All right, a spectrogram produces a visual depiction of rapid variations in the acoustic signal. And it gives you 3 pieces of information. And we talked about time already, which is really, really important now. We're going to look at, you can look at time kind of on a broad scale and understand it like in the terms of like utterances, but you can also look at it even on the millisecond level, where you'd be looking at differences in an individual phoneme from whenever you start doing one thing to start doing another thing as part of a phoneme, because some of our phonemes are going to shift, not just our diphthongs, but like our affricates and our plosives are all going to have different phases that are going to be involved with them. We also can determine frequency in terms of both harmonics and formants, and then we'll see intensity. It's not that we're necessarily as concerned about how loud this person's speaking in terms of intensity, but we're more concerned with which frequencies are being produced more intensely. Okay, so it's not he's speaking at 70 decibels or he's speaking at 50 decibels. It's that harmonic is being amplified at that level, or that frequency range is being amplified at that level or dampened at that level. Okay? We have 2 types of spectrograms. We have a narrow band and a wide band. We're going to be focused much more on wide band in this class because we're going to be looking at formants much more than we are going to be looking at the harmonics of speech. We'll look at both of these as we're kind of looking up here. Now, if you're thinking about being a voice scientist, like what Dr. GR does type things, then the narrow band is a little bit more clinically applicable. So people like singers and things like that, they want to do those. But those aren't as good for speech as are the wide band. And we'll kind of talk about that as we're working our way through. Okay, so here you can see the 2 of them in comparison. We have a narrow band on top and a wide band on the bottom. They look different, okay? I'm not positive the resolution is going to show up good enough on this situation, but you would notice that the narrow band has horizontally oriented lines versus the wide band is going to have vertically oriented lines. Sorry, I spoke incorrectly earlier. The narrow band's horizontally, so that's going to be the ones on the top. And the wide band is going to be the vertical ones on the bottom. All right, narrow band spectrograms are created with really, really high resolution frequency analysis. So when we think about resolution, I know that can be a complicated term for many to kind of wrap their heads around. But like if you just think about like taking a picture, like I can take a picture if you picture yourself sitting in the speech science lab. Like if I just want to show you what the whole lab kind of looks like, I can get a nice aerial and I can take a picture of the entire thing. Versus if I wanted to understand what maybe one of the posters on the back wall looks like, I'm going to have to zoom in more on that one, which means I'm going to lose some of the other elements of it. It's just really what you're focused upon. Okay, so if I'm zoomed in on one aspect, I'm losing some other parts. But if I'm zoomed out, I'm gaining more of the big picture, but I'm losing some of the fine detail which is associated with it. Okay, so when we're focused upon harmonics like we would be with a narrow band, we're losing some of the time that we're concerned with. All right, here's another illustration of them side by side. On the top, this time we actually have the wide band, and on the bottom we have the narrow band. What we're seeing up here on the very, very top is just kind of the oscillations or the cycles of the disturbances in air pressure. That's just kind of a measure of sound energy. We're not all that concerned with that one. It does, we will use it a little bit once we get into our lab to kind of understand where sound is actually occurring. Okay, because if we're seeing a flat line right there, it's actually not a kind of perceivable sound versus that initial little spike that we see right there has a lot more energy associated with it. Let's look at the narrow band part of it, right? And I'll bounce back and forth between this slide and the upcoming note slides quite a bit here. All right, with the narrow band, we have horizontal lines. They're going to be kind of stacked like sediments. We have longer duration typically for that one because we can oftentimes be concerned with, from a voice scientist perspective, how long they can hold out a note or something like that. So the darker lines in that situation are going to represent the harmonics that are going to be closest to the formants. Okay, so let's go back to that actual slide. So as you see here, we have that kind of striations, just like they're stacked layer upon layer. The ones that are darker, like right here and right here, those are going to be the ones that are closer to a formant during this little section of speech which we have right here. Okay, this is connected speech here because we can see that there's some variance in the changing parts of it. But these little darker shaded regions are going to be the harmonics that are close to it, okay? So as you look your way down here, you can start to count. There's first, second, third, fourth, so forth and so on, the number of harmonics. That's just the way in which you determine which harmonic is this. You would count from 0 at the bottom all the way up to 1 and all the way up to however high it is that the lines are actually perceivable. So that's what we're kind of getting from that. Sorry. A lot of times we're setting limits on this one. This is the same discussion which I had earlier about like when you zoom in, you focus upon what's important to you. So usually we're not going below 30 to 50 hertz just because there's not an awful lot of sound which exists down there. Okay, so we don't need to, if we cut out that part of the room, given my aerial view of the room analogy, we cut out the part that's not important to us, we can focus better on the parts that are important to us. Okay, so in that situation, they're cutting out the 30 to 50. They'll cut out some at the top of it as well. A lot of times in this situation, we are concerned with a number of measures which we'll be discussing in grad school, but we're concerned with like voice quality and these types of things. Okay, we have measures which are associated with that. We're not really going to get into that one in this situation. But the fundamental frequency and prosody, the prosodic elements, the rise and fall of speech is going to be important when you're looking at it from that perspective, okay? Now, that's not really the perspective which we're going to be taking. We're more concerned with wideband spectrograms because these are going to be more associated with the actual speech signal itself, regardless of whether or not speech is good or bad. These are the kind of things which we're going to get to, okay? Now, in this situation, once again, I said vertical lines, but remember with our all right, sorry, I forgot to advance it, but with our vertical lines, let's go back and look at it. All right, that's this one right here with our vertical lines. It's up there. Okay, with our vertical lines, each one of those is going to equal a glottal pulse as well. So we're having, it's segmented in that situation, and that's what we're seeing. So the actual vertically oriented lines are going to be segmented like that. Right now, something that if you're still on the previous slide at home, this slide, I wanted to actually illustrate it on the image. But when you have these darker lines right here, those are going to be what are called our formants. Okay, so to measure a formant, you would actually go right to the middle of one of those, and then you would be able to trace it over to the y-axis, and you would find the frequency of those formants. So I wish I could point over there, but my box isn't big enough to do that right now. But you can see over there to the far, I'm not sure what's the closest to the beginning of that one, you'll see that there's 4 dark sections of that one, right? That represents F1, F2, F3, and F4 as you're working your way up there, okay? Remember, we're not even concerned with the F4. It's there, but it's not going to make a huge difference in determining what this sound is versus any other sound. Okay, so when you look at that one, we see that right in the middle of that one is going to be F1. It will never be F2, okay? Remember, F2 will not go lower than that. How do I know that? Right, I know that because the pharyngeal cavity will always be the biggest cavity, Right? The pharyngeal cavity will always be the biggest cavity, therefore it's always going to be the lowest up there. That's my F1. And the next thing I have is going to be my F2, the next one's going to be my F3, and the next one's going to be my F4, okay? Sometimes it's going to show up really, really easily, like it does over there at the beginning. Sometimes it's going to show up much more faintly as it does over there toward the right. So let's make sure we're complete with all right. Make sure we're more complete with the notes part of this one. The darker lines are going to represent the formants, as I already said. That's the center of each of the dark bands, so you don't start at the bottom of it or the top of it. You go right toward the center of that situation. And when we have articulatory distinctions, so I make an articulatory movement, what I do is I move those formants. Okay, that's something I could not see when we were talking about it from a spectrum standpoint. Like you can't see movement on that one because it's a picture. This is a spectrogram, so I can see where there's movement occurring. So if I see that a formant is shaped like this and it starts to move like that, that means I'm doing something with my tongue. That means I'm doing something with my lips. I'm doing something with the articulators in order to change the size and shape. Okay, when we think about spectrum, you're playing a tuba, you set it down, now you can play a trumpet. Right, you set it down, now you can play a mellophone, now you can play some other instrument, okay? In this situation, we're talking about speech. You're not setting an instrument down to pick up a new one, you're dynamically changing on the fly. All right, every single sound that you make is going to be, you've made a new set of formants. Every sound you make is going to have different articulatory configurations. So you're picking up thousands of instruments along the way, and you're just using whichever one's going to be appropriate for that sound. Okay? Now, this also doesn't rely on periodicity. Okay, so when we talked about looking at this thing, we talked about seeing the vertical lines, right? The vertical lines are showing periodicity, but we also see some of that stuff right after that first set of four formants. We see what looks kind of like just static in that situation, right? That's an aperiodic sound, which we'll get to, right? We're talking about vowels for now. We'll get to those things. But it does show energy. Okay, it's just not showing periodicity. So the spectrogram will show energy in that situation. It's not showing periodicity. How do I know that that's sound and not just like some static that's being picked up by the microphone? Because there are, it shows that when it does not have to have the periodicity. Okay, we have periodicity in that first one because we see formants. Okay, then we don't have periodicity because we don't see formants. And then in the very next sound that you see there, we do have periodicity because once again we're seeing formants. All right, this clicker's really getting annoying. All right, this is the same as looking at spectrums right here, although it's a spectrogram. All right, because these are all each individual pictures of one vowel. It's not showing this vowel shifting to another vowel or anything like that. Okay, so this is actually going to be the same thing we've been talking about when we were talking about our E, and U. Right, so let's find our E. All right, it's that first one right there. What do we say about that vowel? Okay, what is E? How do we produce E? All right, it's a front vowel, meaning we put our tongue in the front, E, E. Right, so when we put our tongue in the front, what do we produce? We produce a very, very low pharyngeal cavity. What do we see over there with our F1 on E? We see it's very, very low down on the spectrum, even according to all these other vowels which we see here. All right, when we moved our tongue toward the front, what did we do to the oral cavity? We made it smaller. Okay, what do smaller things do? They resonate at higher frequencies. So that's why we see that jacked up F2 over there. All right, are we rounding our lips? Nope. So F3 is going to remain about the same. Okay, the other vowel which we looked at was going to be U. Where is it? All right, right there with boot. Okay, so in that situation, we rounded our lips, which lowers the frequency of all of our formants in that situation. So we see a really low F1, a really low F2, and look at that F3 right there. It's going to be really, really low as well. If we're thinking about the in father, okay, remember that was a back vowel. We're taking our tongue and putting it way in the back. So what did we do to F1 in that sound? In F1, we made it extremely small because we moved our tongue into the back. What's that going to do to the frequency response? It's going to raise it. Okay, it'll raise the frequency quite a bit in that situation. So we're going to have a really high frequency F1. What were we doing to F2? We were lowering it because we took our tongue from its rest position and moved it to the back. That made a big oral cavity, so we have a very low F2. right? And then F3 is basically staying the same in that situation, all right? So if you want to see how this is the same as the spectrum, do this, all right? You'll basically see that that picture right there is looking the same as this picture right here, okay? This situation, you turn your head this way, all right? You'd have your y-axis over here, all right? But then this is, that lowest one would be where your first formant would be, then you would have your next formant. You're basically just looking at the spacing of these, okay? If you don't get what I'm talking about here, just check out the spacing of those. So what we just showed was oo. All right, if we're looking at oo, we see that there's big, big, big. All right, if we're talking about ah, we'd see small, big, big. All right, if we're talking about e, we'd see big, small, small. All right. I don't remember what I said for ah, but with ah, we would see small, big, small. Okay, I messed up on F3 there, I believe. Ah, didn't have to go way back. Here's E right here. All right, there's E. And look at the spacing between that. We have F1 and then we have a long time before we get to F2. Now if we look over here at E, we have F1 and we have a long time before we get to F2. There's a lot of real estate between those two. All right, that's what we're seeing. All right, so we're actually going to take a break. That'll be the end of the consonants one. The vowels, we'll finish up with consonants in just a moment.